Hi, this is Dr. Michael Hart, and welcome to our next lecture. Today, we're going to talk about basic terms and definitions. The first term is anarchy. Anarchy literally means no government. The first thing to note is that anarchy, like many of these terms, actually comes from the Greek. This is because the Greeks were the first people, at least in the Western world, to have a systematic and detailed discussion of government and politics. And a number of manuscripts that came down to us actually tell us much about the Greek city-states, about the Greek world, about politics. And so this term, as I said, is Greek in origin. A means no, anarchy, government. Anarchy means no government. Human beings tend to be operating best when they actually have government. In my younger days, I remember often the reports on television about governments collapsing in various places like in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Somalia. We have to remember that even when governments collapse, this refers to the collapse of the central government, maybe the collapse of government in the capital city of Mogadishu in Somalia, or in Kabul in Afghanistan, or in Baghdad in Iraq. However, we have to keep in mind that tribal governments in those countries continue to function, and they provide security, they provide food, shelter. Who gets what, when, and how? After all, that is the quintessential definition of politics. So politically, governments continue to operate even when the central government collapses, and this is something to keep in mind. Also to keep in mind is throughout recorded history, we see that people actually live in government. Anarchic societies are nice to dream about, but they seem to exist mostly in the heads of the people who dream about them. The next two terms are direct democracy and indirect democracy. Why are they different? Why do we have direct democracy and we also have a second type, indirect democracy, and which one is better? Well, it turns out that direct democracy is ruled by the people themselves directly, and that means there are no intermediaries between the laws that people pass and the people themselves, because the people make those laws. That's direct democracy. In an indirect democracy, people do not make their own laws. Instead, they first vote for representatives who then make laws on people's behalf. The founders of the United States did not want to have direct democracy because they distrusted the people. As Alexander Hamilton reportedly said, the masses are the asses. Now, we are not sure whether or not he actually said it or if the attribution is apocryphal. However, the point remains. The founders didn't trust regular folks, and they wanted to have intermediaries who would be elected by the people, who would then make laws on behalf of the people. Another thing to keep in mind is that in a large country like the United States, it can be impractical to have direct democracy. When the Constitution of the United States was written, there were at least 3 million people already in the United States, and there were 13 states spread along much of the eastern seaboard. And so the question becomes, exactly how are people going to meet, where, and make laws themselves? So it would stand to reason that you would rather have people elect their representatives, and then a handful of representatives would make it much easier to meet in a central location instead of having millions of people trying to meet in a central location. Now, this particular problem seemed to have been abolished by the rise of the Internet society. In the age of the Internet, we can argue that it is much easier, and in fact, it is quite practical to allow every citizen to vote directly. But we still don't do it at the national level. When we get deeper into the course, we will discover that, in fact, there is direct democracy, or at least there are some elements of it at the state and local level, but still not at the national level, because at the national level, the Constitution of the United States doesn't really allow for it. So that's the difference between the two types of democracy. A republican form of government is our next term. A republican form of government refers to the authority of laws stemming from the will of the people. What makes the law legal? What makes it legitimate? Well, in a republic, what makes it legitimate is the will of the people. In a monarchy, what makes it legitimate is the sovereign, the monarch. So it's all about the idea or the myth of what stands beyond the law, because the law is supposed to be more than just completely arbitrary and brutish exercise of power. Law is supposed to have behind it some kind of grand element, something that gives it legitimacy. And again, in a republic, it's the people. In a monarchy, it's the king or the queen. So a lot of countries today are republics. The republics were less common in the olden days. Today we have many republics. But also, and this, some students find this surprising, there are still a lot of monarchies in the world. A lot of them remain, and some countries have actually brought monarchies back after a less than auspicious experience with a republican form of government. An example would be Spain, which brought back monarchy in the late 1970s after a long rule by Francisco Franco in that country. So monarchies can come in two varieties, absolute and constitutional. Most monarchies today are, of course, constitutional monarchies. And in these monarchies, the monarch reigns but doesn't rule. So, for example, the Queen of England can read the laws that Parliament passes, and she may say, my government, when she refers to those laws. But whenever she reads the laws, or whenever she refers to my government, she is almost certainly reading a speech that the Prime Minister or his speechwriters have actually written for her. And the same pattern holds true for other constitutional monarchies. The queen or the king may speak for the government, but he or she doesn't actually control the government. Absolute monarchies, only a handful of them remain in the world today, have a king or a queen with a lot of power. And that king or queen can do pretty much anything he or she wants. Not even in an absolute monarchy, however, the king or queen has absolute power, because the king or queen is just one person, limited by physical and intellectual capacity, the capacity to store and process knowledge, and therefore the monarch will be manipulated to greater or lesser extent by his or her advisors, ministers, etc. Why do some countries choose to maintain monarchies, even in their constitutional form? I think for stability. If you have a constitutional monarchy, then the monarch really stands as a figurehead above politics, and therefore is free from the dirty, nasty, and lurid nature that often accompanies politics, and just represents the dignity of your country. And this can be a good and stabilizing thing to have, because people as a whole can come together over this monarch. There's this one great person, one great royal family. But if you have the figurehead and the actual ruler in one person, then that's much, much harder. And if you look at the example of the United States, you find that presidents often find it difficult to govern because their ability to govern is hampered, obstructed, muddied by their unsavory personal reputation, as was the case with Bill Clinton, for example. So in the United States, where you actually have chief executive and the symbol of the country in one person, that person finds it difficult to govern. The next term is oligarchy. Oligarchy means the rule of the few, because oli means few in Greek. So oligarchy is ruled by the few. I would say a lot of countries have been accused of being oligarchies lately, even the United States. So an argument for a country like the US would go something like this. Even though there is a facade of democratic rule and elections still go on, no matter which politicians are elected, all of them are actually on the take in a normal legal way, because corporations and unions and interest groups finance their campaigns. And then corporations and unions and interest groups find a way to connect to these politicians using their public relations professionals, using their lawyers. They find a way to connect, they find a way to get heard, and they find a way to, in the end, influence policymaking to a significant extent, whereas people's influence is of very minimal extent. While politicians still have to be afraid of the people a little bit, because in the end the people vote, in reality, it turns out most politicians who want to be reelected will be reelected. And they have a lot to fear to rich, numerical minorities who are politically skilled, who can cut off their financing, campaign financing, and who can organize public relations campaigns against them. Plutocracy is a form of oligarchy. Plutocracy means rule by the rich. Do we have rule by the rich in modern societies that have this democratic facade? Some have alleged so. Some have said the power of global finance and global high technology has actually brought up a few people, a few billionaires, and a few financial institutions, and many financial funds to the top of the governing pyramid. And politicians, however democratically they may be elected, are just hired hands who are carrying out the will of big finance and high technology. At least this is what some people have accused modern democracies of being. It doesn't mean that I accept this argument. I'm just telling you the argument that exists out there. Plutocracies are forms of oligarchy because in every society, the rich are a numerical minority compared to the rest of society. So, therefore, plutocracies are just a form of oligarchy. Kleptocracies rule by thieves. A number of countries in recent decades have been accused of being kleptocracies, like Russia, Ukraine, Mexico, and the Philippines. Kleptocracy is when political officials go into government and rise through the ranks and become very powerful. They do so because they want to enrich themselves. And of course, if you're in government, there are different ways to enrich yourself. You can take bribes, you can steal from the treasury, or more commonly, you can just skim off the top of public projects. So no-bid contracts, public contracts can be awarded to cronies, relatives, and supporters of powerful politicians who will then, in turn, will reward their supporters with public contracts. And of course, the lavish money of these no-bid contracts will not be fully used to finance actual projects. A portion of the money will be siphoned off into private accounts of these individuals. So this is how kleptocracies tend to operate. They are believed to be highly inefficient for economic development of countries that happen to be ruled by kleptocracies, because resources are being siphoned into the private hands of a few people who often take this money and invest it abroad. They take it out of the country just as a precaution or for better investment opportunities. Or they buy palaces or yachts, again, very often in foreign countries. Next is separation of powers. And presidential system that I have here in parentheses is actually a common way to refer to the same idea. Separation of powers was outlined in detail by Charles Montesquieu, a Frenchman who in the 18th century wrote his book, The Spirit of the Laws, and praised the government of the UK in that book, stating that the UK is a better government than the government of France because the UK, unlike France, has separation of powers. And in the UK, the parliament is the legislative branch and the monarch is the executive, and the courts are independent. So there are distinct branches of government. And then the founders of the US Constitution, who had a very high opinion of Charles Montesquieu actually adopted this idea and said, yeah, that's great. Let's have separation of powers so that no entity of government would be able to dominate the entire political process. Montesquieu, I believe, misread what was actually happening in the UK at the time, as I think by then, meaning 18th century, the parliament had already become supreme, and the king more or less became the figurehead. The alternative to the separation of powers idea, which is also sometimes known as the presidential system, is the legislative system, or sometimes known as parliamentary supremacy. So what is legislative or parliamentary supremacy? This is when you do not have distinct branches of government. The example, again, can be the UK or Canada or Australia or Denmark, countries that, instead of separating powers, really have their elected representatives in their legislature, which most frequently is known as parliament. From inside the members of parliament, they choose their executive. So members of the executive are not members of a separate branch. Rather, they are members of parliament whose party or coalition of parties has a majority at the time and whose party or coalition of parties trusts them to assume the executive responsibilities. And once the majority in parliament no longer trusts them to do so, then the majority of parliament can undo that government, and the government collapses. And then the parliament has to choose, by a new majority, has to choose the new executive. So there is not a separation into distinct branches, because the executive is a part of the legislative and is responsible to it. Which system of the two is best is really not the subject of this lecture or even of this class, because this is not a comparative government class. Suffice it to say that there are advantages and disadvantages to both. Next term is unitary system. Unitary system refers to the distribution of authority whereby all governments below the national government are local. All governments below the national government are local. This means that local governments have no right to exist. The national government created them and it can abolish them. It can also merge two or more of them into one, and it can take one and break it up into several different ones. So that's a unitary system. And when the national government does that, when it abolishes or creates or merges or breaks up local governments, it does so at will. There is no need for a consent by the local government. Many countries are actually unitary, like Italy or the UK. And then there are countries that are federal. Federalism was an American invention. The United States is a federal system. So does Canada, so does Australia, so does India, so does Mexico. In a federal system, you have an intermediate level of government that is between the national and the local levels. And this intermediate level of government, at least in the United States, is strong enough to have its own right to exist. For this, you can turn to Article 4 of the Constitution, and you will find that the national government cannot break up the state without its consent, nor can the national government merge two or more states into one without the consent of said states. And this really is the essence of state sovereignty, the independent right of the states to exist. And in a federal system like the United States, there's typically division of responsibilities, some of which are non-overlapping. That is to say, states have the right to do some things that the national government does not, and vice versa. For example, in the United States, only state governments can establish a secondary system of public education. The national government may not. And also, only the national government can actually print or coin money in the United States, and state governments may not. Confederate system is a system in which the national government is a creature of the states. It is not only created by them, but it also can be undone by them. And it tends to have very little power. It usually can do next to nothing without the states agreeing that it does so. So the first government of the United States was actually a Confederate system. The Articles of Confederation, written in 1777 during the Revolutionary War and approved in 1781, were the first government of the United States. And the Articles of Confederation proved to be less than good for what followed. What followed was poverty, foreclosures, debtors' prisons, and rebellions like the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. So between 1781, which is the year in which the War for Independence practically ended because Cornwallis surrendered to Washington in 1781, although technically there would be no peace agreement until 1783, but the war ended for all practical purposes in 81. So between 1781 and 1787, economically, things were not going too well in the United States. And the central government found itself powerless to address these problems. This triggered a number of the elites in the United States to contemplate change. And they tried this change with the convention in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786. The convention failed. They tried to make changes again in 1787 in Philadelphia, and not everybody showed up. So they couldn't really make changes, and some delegates left and others stayed, and those who stayed wrote a whole new document known as the Constitution of the United States, which the United States uses to this day. And the Constitution, of course, was written in 1787 and approved in 1788. So the Confederate system was replaced in America by the federal system. Next is totalitarian state or regime. In a totalitarian state or regime, the government wants to control more than your behavior. It wants to control your thoughts. So if you think about politics incorrectly, that's a thought crime. Now, the government doesn't really care whether you prefer color red to color blue. That doesn't matter. Matters of taste are irrelevant, but matters of politics are always relevant. And if you disagree with the official dogma, the official ideology, this can turn out very badly for you and even for your family members. Potentially you could lose everything, including your life. Regimes like the Soviet Union or the Nazi Germany can be called totalitarian regimes. China in the past, perhaps under Mao Zedong, but not today, could be called a totalitarian state. And some have accused the Catholic Church of being totalitarian, particularly in the past, when it would torture and burn heretics at the stake. Not necessarily because they tried to assassinate somebody, but because they disagreed with the official dogma of the church. Authoritarian states or regimes do not care about the thoughts in your head. They just want to control your behavior. So they do not want you to demonstrate very much. They do not want you to speak against the government. But in your own head, you can have any thoughts. Examples might be military governments of Latin America. In the past, the majority of Latin American countries have gone through military dictatorships, and I think it would be fair to characterize those dictatorships as authoritarian states or regimes. Freedom, well, you see, in the modern world, in democratic societies, freedom means individual freedom. Typically, when people hear this word, they think of the freedom to date whomever they want, marry whomever they want, enjoy any food that they want, live wherever they want, pick their major in college, pick their occupation, and so on and so forth. Individual freedom. But it doesn't mean, for example, freedom from economic insecurity or freedom from hunger. So freedom in modern post-industrial societies of the 20th and 21st centuries means individual freedom. Class is a group that has a vertical or hierarchical component. So when you talk about classes, you're talking about groups that are vertically arranged. There's an upper class and middle class and lower class. Middle class is not necessarily always present, but if it is present, it's better for the stability, political stability of the country, and also it contributes to a more equitable economic distribution. So they say in the United States and many other post-industrial democratic societies, the middle class is disappearing, partly due to the erosion of the industrial base, due to outsourcing to countries where labor is cheaper, and also because you see the rich and the poor, that is to say the upper and the lower classes, have found a way to get the middle class to pay for most of the expenses, including for the support of the poor. Like the poor have health care, they have free education, and they have subsidized housing, and the middle class pays for it all. So the middle class has to pay for itself and also for the poor. That's an argument that some people make. Political economy is anything that is located at the intersection of politics and economics, like the class analysis, an example of which I gave you just now, or an issue like international trade, because it has economic aspects and political aspects. Economic aspects would include things like the impact of international trade on wages, and political aspects would be the impact of international trade on relations between countries. Religion. Religion is surprisingly difficult to define. About a dozen years ago, I was called upon to teach religious classes at a different institution where I no longer teach. But it's tricky to try to give a definition of religion that would be inclusive. It really is. The most I can probably say is that religion has at least two elements. First, it has a system of beliefs. And second, it has a collection of practices. Now, if you think that this definition is not particularly descriptive, it's not particularly rich, then I would suggest you might be right. But also, it might be difficult to expand the definition in any significant way, because as soon as you do that, you exclude other religions from the definition. So if you refer to God, then what about religions that have no God, like Buddhism? What about religions that have multiple gods, like any polytheistic religion has, by definition, multiple gods? So that's hard. Now, I wanted to bring this up because this is going to have tremendous impact, practical impact, in the context of the Constitution and the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution, in the First Amendment, protects religion twice. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof. And so if you have the word religion right in the text of the Constitution, then this word has to be interpreted by the courts, and ultimately the highest court in the country, the Supreme Court of the United States, in order to filter those claims that are truly religious from those claims that are not religious. What definition of religion can you come up with? And to make a long story short, over the course of generations, the United States Supreme Court gave a number of different and partial definitions of religion. And none are probably fully satisfactory for the reasons I have explained. So these are the very basic terms that any student of political science has to know in order to go forward in an introductory political science class. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thanks very much. And I will see you in the next one.